Exodus Synchronicity. What was happening in Africa when Moses crossed? What if I told you that as Moses crossed the Red Sea, Africa was experiencing a synchronized awakening? You probably think the Exodus was an isolated desert event. But the year 1446 BC witnessed the rise of mighty kingdoms in Kush and Senegambia. Today, we peel back the historical layers that Rome erased to hide this continental connection. Pay attention, because the prophetic timeline of your ancestors is about to be revealed. Traditional Sunday school framings often present the Exodus as a small family drama, a localized flight of slaves into an empty Sinai desert. But when we anchor this event in the solid ground of the 1446 BC timeline, a much larger reality emerges. The Nile Valley synchronicity reveals that Egypt was not acting in a vacuum. It was surrounded by powerful neighbors, and its sudden collapse sent shockwaves across the entire African continent. Perhaps we have been looking at a partial picture, ignoring how the geological and geopolitical changes in Egypt triggered shifts in kingdoms that official textbooks completely ignore. I believe we must examine this year of 1446 BC as a global turning point rather than a localized biblical myth, forcing us to re-examine everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. To understand this, we must look beyond the borders of ancient Kemet. While Egypt was facing the plagues and the loss of its workforce, a golden superpower was rising to its absolute peak just to the south. This was the Kerma civilization, the ancient kingdom of Kush, boasting formidable archers and wealth that rivaled the pharaohs. For centuries, historians have separated biblical Israel from black African kingdoms, but the archaeology suggests their paths were deeply intertwined. You are taught that Moses only encountered nomadic tribes in the wilderness, but he was actually walking the trade routes of a highly developed African network. Further west, across the vast Sahel, the megalithic builders of West Africa were raising massive stone circles aligned with the stars, proving a sophisticated understanding of cosmic order during this exact same era. When you sit with the timeline, you begin to see the beauty of this synchronization. These civilizations were not disconnected. They were parts of a grand African canvas that God was moving upon. In this journey, I have come to believe that the Exodus was not just the birth of a nation, but the catalyst for a continental awakening. We promise to map these connections step by step, showing how the history of Kush, Punt, and West Africa aligns perfectly with the Hebrew scriptures to recover the heritage that was stolen from you. To begin this reconstruction, we must look at the mathematical precision of the biblical text itself. The primary anchor is found in 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1, which states that Solomon began building the temple exactly 480 years after the children of Israel came out of Egypt. Historians widely agree that Solomon's fourth year was 966 BC. If you add 480 years, you land precisely in 1446 BC. This is not a guess. It is a solid anchor. Yet, if you walk into most modern seminaries today, you will encounter a strange silence regarding this timeline. They prefer a later date in the 13th century BC, probably because they want to match Hollywood movies rather than scripture. But why this cover-up? The 1446 BC date matches Egyptian chronology with stunning accuracy, specifically aligning with the reign of Pharaoh Thutmose III. When we align these timelines, we find a perfect match. Thutmose III spent his reign launching campaigns into the Levant, establishing a massive empire.
Its records show he was a ruthless expansionist, and I believe his sudden death created the perfect geopolitical vacuum for the Exodus to occur. Why do our teachers hide these correlations? It seems they are afraid of the archaeological validations that emerge when you study this era.
Perhaps they want to keep our history separated from the physical records of the Nile Valley. When we establish the scientific credibility of 1446 BC, we shatter the myth that our ancestors' story is just a collection of tales. The archaeological record shows that this was a period of global shift, a time when ancient empires were suddenly thrown into chaos. If you want to understand your heritage, you must look at the primary evidence for yourself. Study the primary sources. The timeline is not a mystery. It is a map. And when you follow this map, you realize that the narrative you have been given by mainstream academia is incomplete. This brings us to Pharaoh Amenhotep II, the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Historical records show that early in his reign he launched massive military campaigns. However, after his 9th year, these campaigns suddenly stopped. The empire went into a dramatic decline. The new kingdom was hit by a profound crisis. Why would a powerful pharaoh, at the height of his empire's strength, suddenly abandon all military conquest? The Bible gives us the answer. Egypt's army, chariots, and horsemen were drowned in the depths of the sea. Let us admit what mainstream history refuses to say. The sudden loss of over 2 million slave laborers, combined with the destruction of the elite chariot corps, would throw any superpower into economic ruin. This explains why Egyptian records after 1446 BC show a complete lack of military campaigns. The empire was vulnerable, crippled by divine judgment. I think it is likely that this new kingdom crisis opened the door for Kush, the powerful kingdom to the south, to assert its absolute sovereignty. This vulnerability was not just economic, it was spiritual and military. The power vacuum left by the Exodus shifted the balance of power across the entire continent, a theme we will explore as we cross the desert to Kush. But before we look south, we must understand the physical crossing itself and the geography that connected these worlds. We will bridge this narrative to the Red Sea, tracing the footsteps of your ancestors as they walked through the walls of water. To understand how the Exodus was physically connected to the African continent, we must examine the specific geography of the crossing point. For centuries, traditional illustrations have depicted the crossing at the shallow, marshy lakes of northern Egypt, but this common view contradicts both scripture and physical reality. The true site of the crossing is located at the Gulf of Aqaba, specifically at the Nuweiba Beach landing. Picture it, a vast beach on the eastern shore of the Sinai Peninsula, large enough to hold millions of people, hemmed in by steep mountain ranges. There was no escape. They were trapped between the desert and the deep sea. This Nuweiba beach layout is the only geographical location that matches the biblical description of the crossing, proving that this was a physical event with concrete geological markers. But the most shocking proof lies beneath the water itself. Modern marine surveys of the Gulf of Aqaba have revealed a massive underwater land bridge stretching from Nuweiba Beach directly across to Saudi Arabia. This is not a deep, jagged chasm like the rest of the Gulf. Instead, it is a smooth, gradual pathway with a slope so gentle that millions of people, along with their livestock, could easily walk across. Furthermore, divers have discovered coral formations encasing what appear to be ancient chariot wheels and axles resting on this underwater bridge. Mainstream science probably dismisses these findings as natural coral growth, but the physical shape of these anomalies suggests otherwise. Perhaps we are looking at the literal wreckage of Pharaoh's army, preserved under the sea as a permanent witness to divine intervention. This underwater bridge is not a random geological anomaly. It is directly linked to the movement of the African continental plates. The Gulf of Aqaba is a continuation of the Great Rift Valley, a massive geological tear that runs thousands of miles down the African continent. The tectonic plates that shaped this crossing are part of the very structure of Africa. I have come to believe that God used the natural tectonic lines of the continent to manifest his miraculous deliverance, demonstrating his sovereignty over both geology and history. This crossing was not an isolated exit from Egypt. It was an entry into a larger African destiny. As Israel walked through the divided waters, they were stepping onto the pathway that led directly to their integration with the rising Nubian Empire. Mainstream textbooks remain silent on this Rift Valley connection, likely because it forces them to acknowledge the continental framework of the biblical narrative. In the next chapter of this journey, We will follow these paths southward, to the golden superpower of Kush, where the descendants of Ham were establishing an empire that would rival any on Earth. As we follow the Rift Valley southward, we enter the territory of Kush, a name that echoes throughout the Old Testament. While traditional narratives focus entirely on Egypt, the Bible constantly references Kush. In 1446 BC, this region was ruled by the Kerma Classic period, a highly advanced Nubian superpower. Kerma was a sovereign empire boasting feared, melanated warriors who dominated the Nile trade routes. I recall researching the ancient excavations at Kerma, where archaeologists uncovered massive defensive structures and evidence of a highly organized society. This Kushite sovereignty was a direct geopolitical rival to Egypt's southern expansion. For centuries, Eurocentric depictions have portrayed ancient Nubia as a primitive hinterland, but the archaeological evidence completely shatters this. Kerma was a sprawling urban center, and its military strength was respected. I remember sitting with the records of the Egyptian New Kingdom, which show that the pharaohs feared the archers of Kush, referring to Nubia as the land of the bow. In 1446 BC, this military dominance was at its peak. As Egypt was crippled by the plagues, the Kushites probably saw an opportunity to consolidate their power, establishing a zone of security. Perhaps the Exodus was the catalyst that allowed Kerma to reach its peak. This Nubian superpower is the missing piece of the Exodus puzzle. When you look at the geography, it is clear that Egypt's collapse was Kush's gain. The melanated warriors of Kerma stood ready to defend their borders, proving that African military dominance was a real barrier to northern expansion. I believe this erasure is deliberate, designed to hide the true scale of African civilization during the biblical era. But when you study the primary sources, the truth is undeniable. Kush was a force to be reckoned with, standing proud under the African sun. The architectural symbol of this peak was the Western Defufa, a colossal mud brick monument that still towers over Kerma. Unlike anything built in Egypt, the Defufa was a unique masterpiece of Nubian engineering, serving as both a temple and a stronghold. Picture it, a massive solid block of clay and brick rising 3 stories high, its walls plastered in gypsum that would gleam under the desert sun. To this day, the Western Defufa monument stands as a testament to the sophistication of its builders, proving that ancient Kush possessed capabilities that rivaled the pyramid builders of the north. This architectural marvel was funded by Kerma's absolute gold trade dominance. The deserts of Kush were rich in gold, and the Kushites controlled the flow of this metal. I have come to believe that much of the gold that circulated in Egypt originated in Nubia. When we examine the cemetery burials of kings at Kerma, we find royal tombs filled with gold jewelry and luxury goods. These burials are not the graves of primitive chieftains. They are the resting places of wealthy, sophisticated emperors who controlled global trade networks. This trade network suggests a deep connection between the Nile Valley and the broader ancient world. It is likely that the gold of Kush was traded widely, bridging the worlds of the Bible and East Africa. As we look at the ruins of Kerma, we must sit with the realization that this was a wealthy, highly developed empire that was fully active at the moment Moses led his people. In the next part of this chapter, we will explore the spiritual dimension of this Kushite empire, examining how its people were woven into the very fabric of the biblical covenant. The connection between Kush and the biblical narrative is not merely economic or military. It is deeply spiritual. We find a stunning key in the book of Numbers, chapter 12, verse 1, which states that Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Kushite woman he had married. For he had married a Kushite woman. This verse is often glossed over in modern Sunday schools, but it represents a profound moment of covenant blood integration. Moses, the lawgiver of Israel, had chosen a wife from the melanated nobility of Kush. Why would Moses, under divine inspiration, make such a choice? I think it is likely that Moses was sealing a spiritual alliance, recognizing that the people of Kush were not outsiders to the covenant, but were already aligned with the worship of the one true God. This marriage reveals that the ancient Hebrew family was physically and culturally intertwined with the kingdoms of Africa from the very beginning of the law-giving era. Perhaps the standard modern depictions of a culturally isolated Israel are nothing more than a historical fabrication. For generations, standard biblical commentary has offered a deeply biased and perhaps even racist interpretation of this passage. They claim Miriam's anger was about a mismatch in culture or status, ignoring the plain text. But when you look at the Hebrew word Cushite, it refers directly to the dark-skinned people of the Nubian Nile Valley. Miriam's rebellion was punished by God with leprosy, turning her skin white as snow, a bitter irony that directly confronted her prejudice. I believe this judgment was a clear warning. God would not tolerate the exclusion of Cush from the covenant. The Cushites were not cursed. They were part of the sacred family. This marriage was not a mistake. It was a deliberate spiritual alliance with Midian and Cush, connecting the priesthood of the desert with the royal bloodlines of Africa. It seems that Miriam was attempting to enforce a division that God himself rejected, proving that the covenant has always been inclusive of the melanated families of the earth. When we decode this history, we must assert Nubia's rightful place in the biblical covenant. If you study the scriptures, you will see that Cush is named 56 times, always as a place of wealth, strength, and divine favor. The covenant was never restricted to a single geography. It was a continental inheritance that bound the Nile Valley and the land of Canaan together. Do not allow mainstream theology to make you feel like your ancestors were mere onlookers in biblical history. The blood of Cush was in the very household of Moses. This means that the history of the Exodus is your history, and the spiritual legacy of these ancient empires lives in your blood today. We must stand on this truth as we continue our journey, mapping the connections that prove our place in the divine design. Mainstream academia probably wants you to believe that the biblical patriarchs were European or isolated from Africa, but the physical evidence and the scripture itself prove a different reality. You must claim this heritage for yourself, recognizing the royal priesthood that was established in the wilderness. While the Nile Valley was experiencing the dramatic events of the Exodus, another massive realization of human intelligence was taking place on the other side of the continent. If you travel to West Africa, into modern Senegal and Gambia, you will find the Senegambian stone circles, a vast network of megaliths that represent one of the ancient world's greatest secrets. These circles were not placed randomly. They were arranged with mathematical precision, serving as an ancient observatory. Standard history books often ignore West Africa, implying that advanced astronomy only existed in Europe or Asia. But these circles demonstrate that our ancestors mapped the cosmos with accuracy long before modern science was born. Picture it: hundreds of heavy red laterite pillars, carved into perfect cylindrical shapes, standing in circular formations against the African sky. These pillars align precisely with equinox alignments, marking the exact movements of the sun throughout the year. When you study the geometry of these sites, you realize that the builders possessed a deep, scientific understanding of the Earth's rotation. Standard archaeology compares these West African megaliths to Stonehenge, but they rarely highlight the timeline. Stonehenge was built in stages, and many circles show active construction overlapping with the biblical era. I believe this reveals a shared global intelligence, a synchronized understanding of the universe. This astronomical alignment is a monument to West African scientific genius. The stone circles prove that while Moses organized the tabernacle, other African minds were carving the earth to map the heavens. Perhaps the mainstream narrative wants you to believe our ancestors were primitive nomads, but the laterite pillars stand as an irrefutable contradiction. The timeline is clear, and the physical evidence is carved in stone. When you connect 1446 BC to this West African network, you realize that the divine order was moving across the entire continent, establishing beacons of light and knowledge. To build these massive observatories, the ancient West Africans had to employ highly sophisticated laterite quarrying technology. Laterite is a dense, iron-rich rock that is extremely difficult to shape without specialized tools. Yet, the builders carved these monolithic pillars from solid rock faces, transporting them miles to their final destinations. This megalithic culture was not the work of a primitive society. It was the product of a highly organized, technologically advanced civilization. We must analyze these complex quarrying techniques, recognizing the engineering skill required to cut, transport, and raise stones weighing up to 10 tons each without modern machinery.
Let us admit what mainstream history desperately tried to hide. The existence of these monuments completely constructs the myth of primitive African societies. You cannot carve, literalize, and organize global alignments without a stable, prospered, and highly educated population.
Furthermore, excavations have uncovered evidence of iron working and Iron Age development that matches the era of construction. I think it is likely that West Africa was undergoing a metallurgical revolution at the exact moment Egypt's military might was collapsing in the Red Sea. The timing is not a coincidence. It is a synchronized expansion of technology. This metallurgical advancement shows that West Africa was fully integrated into the global technology networks of the ancient world. The construction dates link these circles directly to the biblical Exodus era, proving that our ancestors were building monuments of stone and iron, while Israel was journeying through the desert. We must acknowledge this engineering legacy, restoring West Africa to its rightful place. In the next part of this chapter, we will explore the spiritual and symbolic meaning of these stones, examining how they connected the earth to the cosmic covenant. The physical scale of these stone circles is matched only by their profound spiritual significance. When archaeologists began to excavate beneath the red laterite pillars, they discovered ancestor veneration burials, proving that these sites were not merely physical observatories, but sacred resting places.
I remember visiting the laboratory archive where researchers analyzed the buried god, finding that the deceased were laid to rest with a careful ceremonial honor. These burials reveal a deep belief in the afterlife and a respect for the external lineage.
The stone pillars acted as guardians of the dead, keeping watch over the bones of the elders under the vast African sky. It is likely that these burials were reserved for the elite, the spiritual and political leaders of the megalithic culture, ensuring their memory was preserved for generations. This sacred geography represents a cosmic, covenant connection, linking the earth to the heavens and the living to the dead. The circular formations of the stones symbolized the eternal cycle of life, creation, and divine order. In my research, I have come to believe that these builders were not isolated pagans, but were practicing a sophisticated form of monotheism that recognized the Creator's hand in the stars. The circle itself was a symbol of unity, a cosmic boundary that separated the holy ground from the ordinary wilderness. The alignment with the equinoxes suggests that they believed their earthly covenant was mirrored in the permanent movements of the sun, establishing a literal bridge between the dust of the Sahel and the throne of the heavens, probably serving as a place of national gathering during the sacred seasons. This West African practice of raising stone circles bears a striking resemblance to the biblical account of Israel's journey. I recall the story in the book of Joshua chapter 4, where the Israelites raised 12 stones at Gilgal to commemorate their crossing of the Jordan River. These pillars at Gilgal were raised for the exact same purpose, to serve as a permanent, physical witness to a covenant crossing. The spiritual sophistication of the West African builders was not inferior to the priesthood of Israel. Both understood that stone was a language that time could not erase, a physical receipt of their place in the divine timeline. As we look at these monuments, we must reject the Eurocentric lies and reclaim the spiritual brilliance of our ancestors, recognizing that the sacred geography of Africa was fully aligned with the covenant of God. The silent stones of Senegambia are perhaps the loudest witnesses to this forgotten truth, proving that the African soil has always held the record of the divine design. To understand how the Exodus was physically connected to the African continent, we must examine the years Moses spent in the wilderness before the crossing. When Moses fled Egypt, he did not enter an empty void. He fled to Midian, establishing a Midian-Sinai connection that is fundamentally African in its geographical context. Here, he met Jethro, a priest of the desert, who would become his mentor. Jethro's priestly wisdom was perhaps not a pagan system, but a highly sophisticated understanding of the true Creator. As you sit with the text, you realize that Moses did not receive the law in isolation. He was educated in the desert by an elder who carried the ancient priesthood. This Jethro-Moses connection is linked to the Kenite lineage linked. The Kenites were a metalworking clan of the Midianites, connected to the trade routes of Sinai and East Africa. When we decode the genealogies, we find that the Kenites were integrated into Israel's camp, walking with them throughout the journey. Mainstream commentaries usually ignore this African connection, portraying Jethro as a temporary assistant. But the scriptures reveal that the Kenites carried a lasting legacy, showing that Moses' family was rooted in the melanated lineages of the desert. This means the very framework of Sinai's priesthood was shaped by African influences. When we examine this geographical framework, we must recognize that the Sinai was the eastern gateway of the African continent. The geology, the trade routes, and the desert networks were all parts of a broader African ecosystem. I believe that Moses' 40 years in the wilderness were a period of cultural deprogramming, preparing him to lead a people out of slavery. He had to learn the ways of the desert from the Kenite elders, proving that the foundation of Israel's law was built on the soil of Africa. The wilderness of Sinai was a bustling hub of Sinai Peninsula trade, traversed by nomadic caravans and guarded by Egyptian border fortresses. To survive in this environment, you had to know the water sources and the local nomads. Among these desert dwellers, the most significant were the Shasu of Wuhu nomads, a group mentioned in ancient Egyptian records. These Shasu nomads were real peoples who inhabited the deserts of Midian, carrying a distinct name for their god. The Egyptian inscriptions at the Solab temple contain the earliest mention of the name Yahweh, linked directly to these nomads. Let us look at this evidence directly. The Egyptian temple records prove that the name of your God was known in the deserts of Midian long before Israel ever set foot in Canaan. This is the earliest archaeological validation of the sacred name, and it is carved in the stone of an Egyptian border fortress. Why does standard theology remain silent on these Solab inscriptions? Probably because they do not want you to know that the name Yahweh has deep roots in the African desert. I think it is likely that the Shasu nomads were connected to the Midianite network. This connection bridges the route of Israel's march to the broader geology of the continent. The desert was a highway of trade and spiritual revelation that connected Cush, Egypt, and Midian. As Israel marched, they followed established pathways walked by African nomads for centuries. We must understand this desert network, recognizing that the Exodus was a journey through an active African landscape. In the next part of this chapter, we will examine the divine presence that guided them, looking at the sanctuary that walked with the remnant. As Israel journeyed deeper into the desert, they were not left to navigate the harsh African wilderness alone. The scriptures describe a supernatural guide that went before them, a pillar of fire and cloud that provided light by night and shade by day. For centuries, traditional Sunday school illustrations have depicted this pillar as a small, isolated wisp of smoke floating above the camp. But this common view diminishes the physical reality. This was a massive atmospheric shield that protected millions of people from the scorching desert sun. It was a visible manifestation of the Creator's presence, a defensive dome that kept the camp cool by day and warm by night, proving that God's protection was a physical reality in the dry land. Perhaps this atmospheric shield was visible to the surrounding nations, serving as a warning that a powerful, supernatural force was moving across the desert, protecting the scattered remnant from any military threat. At the center of this protected camp stood the wilderness sanctuary, a portable temple that served as the earthly footstool of the Creator. When we analyze the tabernacle design, we find a structure that was highly sophisticated and deeply symbolic. Mainstream theology often portrays the tabernacle as an entirely unique invention, with no earthly parallels. But archaeological discoveries suggest a different reality. The layout of the tabernacle, with its outer courtyard, holy place, and innermost holy of holies, closely mirrors the royal military tents of Pharaoh Ramses II and Thutmose III. I think it is likely that Moses was instructed to use a familiar royal design to show that the King of Kings had pitched his tent in the midst of his people. The use of this royal architecture would have been instantly understood by the former slaves, signaling that their God was more powerful than the Pharaoh of Egypt. We must acknowledge this architectural context, rejecting the myth of a culturally disconnected Israel. This comparison does not diminish the tabernacle's holiness. It enhances it. By using a royal military layout, God was declaring that he was the true commander of Israel's army, walking in the midst of the wilderness. The wilderness sanctuary was a literal throne room on the march, proving that the divine presence was active and walking with the remnant. This was not a passive, static temple. It was a dynamic, living covenant that moved with the people. As you study these connections, you realize that the tabernacle was designed to destroy the slave mentality, replacing it with the dignity of a royal priesthood. We must hold this truth in our hearts, recognizing that the tabernacle was a physical sign of God's presence, walking with his people, under the African sun. The silent pillars of the tabernacle are perhaps the loudest witnesses to this royal dignity, proving that the African soil has always held the record of the divine design. While the children of Israel were entering the wilderness, the eastern coast of Africa was engaged in one of the most famous maritime trade networks. This was the trade route to the Empire of Punt, located in the Horn of Africa. Decades before the Exodus, Egypt had established a massive sea connection, culminating in the famous Hatshepsut-Punt expedition. I recall studying the maritime records of the New Kingdom, describing how Queen Hatshepsut commissioned a grand fleet to sail down the Red Sea to trade with this legendary land. The voyage was a physical expedition that brought back immense wealth, proving the existence of a highly organized, prosperous African trade partner. The wealth brought from Punt consisted of myrrh and gold imports, exotic animals, and precious woods. I remember examining the cargo manifests recorded on temple walls, detailing how the Egyptians exchanged their manufactured goods for the natural riches of East Africa. This trade was carried out by a sophisticated Red Sea maritime fleet, demonstrating that ancient Africans had conquered the open waters long before the rise of Greece or Rome. The trade wealth from Punt was a primary pillar of Egypt's prosperity. I believe this reveals that Egypt was economically dependent on its African neighbors, contradicting the myth of Egyptian isolation. We must hold this truth as we map the synchronicity of the desert, proving that the geography of the Bible was connected to a vast African network of trade, power, and culture. The most vivid evidence of this advanced African empire is carved on the Deir el-Bahari murals, the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut. These relief carvings are detailed, realistic depictions of Punt's landscape and people. The murals show King Parahu and Queen Ati, the sovereigns of Punt, standing proud. To this day, these Deir el-Bahari murals stand as a testament to the sophistication of East African society, showing an organized kingdom that traded on equal terms with the greatest superpower of the age. The carvings depict their physical features, their garments, and their royal dignity, leaving no doubt about their advanced culture. The visual representations show stilt houses in wetlands, surrounded by frankincense trees and exotic wildlife. The detail is so precise that biologists have identified the specific species of fish in the water. I have come to believe that this ecological realism proves the Egyptians actually visited the region. These reliefs completely shatter the Eurocentric isolation myths that portray ancient African societies as disconnected from global history, showing a prosperous, highly developed civilization, fully active in 1400 46 BC. It is likely that the trade with Punt was a major source of the raw materials used in the tabernacle itself, linking these stone carvings directly to the Hebrew sanctuary. This architectural sophistication shows that Punt was a highly organized kingdom. As we sit with these relief carvings, we must acknowledge that our ancestors were building stable, wealthy communities, while the empires of Europe were still in their infancy. The ecological and visual evidence is clear, proving that East Africa was a center of culture and trade during the biblical era. In the next part of this chapter, we will examine the spiritual significance of Punt, exploring how this holy land was connected to the prophetic timeline of Israel. The silent stones of Deir el-Bahari are perhaps the loudest witnesses to this forgotten glory. The historical significance of Punt is matched only by its profound spiritual role in the ancient world. In Egyptian records, Punt was not referred to as a mere trading partner. It was called Ta-Netjer, meaning the divine land, or the land of the gods. For the Egyptians, this was a sacred origin place, a land of spiritual purity from which their ancestors and their gods had emerged. Let us admit what mainstream history has tried to obscure. The term Ta-Netjer proves that the Egyptians viewed East Africa as a holy ground, a land closer to the divine presence than their own valley. Why would the greatest empire on earth look to the Horn of Africa as their spiritual home? Probably because they remembered that the roots of their civilization and the sacred knowledge of the Creator flowed from the southern mountains of Africa. This sacred origin was a permanent anchor in their theology, showing that Africa was always the source of light. This sacred designation is directly linked to the biblical geography of the Genesis creation. When we examine the description of Eden in the book of Genesis chapter 2, we find a river that compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of Havilah is described as good, matching the Genesis 10 Havilah gold deposits that were famous throughout antiquity. In my research, I have come to believe that the land of Havilah and the empire of Punt represent a massive geographic overlap, locating the garden's riches in the Horn of Africa. The scriptures and the Egyptian records are mapping the exact same region, describing a land of gold, incense, and divine presence. This is not a coincidence. It is a physical witness to the sacred status of East Africa in antiquity, proving that the cradle of humanity and the wealth of the covenant were rooted in African soil. Perhaps the frankincense used in the temple worship was imported from these very hills, showing a physical connection between Israel's worship and Punt's forests. When we decode this sacred geography, we must recognize that the Horn of Africa was not a marginal wasteland. It was the holy land of antiquity. The spiritual status of Punt and Havilah shows that our ancestors were living in the very lands that God had blessed from the dawn of creation. Mainstream theology usually attempts to place these biblical locations in the Middle East or Europe, ignoring the plain text and the physical geology. But the evidence is clear, proving that the wealth of the covenant and the sacred space of Eden were physically tied to Africa. As we look at these converging timelines, we realize that the Exodus was not just a flight from Egypt. It was a return to the sacred pathways of our ancestors. In the next part of this chapter, we will see how these timelines converged in the year 1446 BC, shifting the balance of power and preparing the continent for a global awakening. The silent ruins of Punt are perhaps the loudest witnesses to this forgotten glory, proving that the African soil has always held the record of the divine design. The year 1446 BC was not just another date on a calendar. It was a cosmic pivot, a prophetic turning point in the history of the world. For too long, you have been taught that the Exodus was a small, localized event that had no impact on the broader world. But when we examine the historical record, we find that the fall of Egypt occurred at the exact moment global shifts were throwing ancient civilizations into chaos. This was a covenant judgment cycle, a moment when the creator of the universe intervened in human affairs to break the power of a prideful superpower. The plagues that struck Egypt were not random disasters. They were targeted judgments designed to expose the impotence of Egypt's gods, sending shockwaves across the entire continent of Africa, establishing a permanent record of divine justice that could not be erased. Why is this timing so critical? Because the sudden collapse of Egyptian power created a geopolitical vacuum that reshaped the destiny of neighboring nations. In the divine design, one kingdom's fall was another's warning, signaling that the era of Egyptian dominance was coming to an end. As you look at the maps of the era, you realize that the plagues were not just a punishment for Pharaoh. They were a message to all nations. Mainstream history prefers to separate the Bible from the physical records, probably because they want to keep you in the dark about the global impact of your ancestors' story. But the synchronicity of these events suggests a larger, coordinated plan that was moving across the African continent. Perhaps the surrounding kings watched the darkening of Egypt's sky with awe and fear, recognizing the hand of the true creator. This prophetic turning point was the catalyst for a broader spiritual awakening of Africa. The kingdoms of Kush and West Africa were not passive observers. They were active participants in this era of change. As the news of Egypt's defeat spread, these nations consolidated their sovereignty, realizing that the old oppressor was powerless. This was a moment of empowerment, a realization that the divine order was moving to vindicate the oppressed.
I think it is likely that the spiritual and political shift we see in Kerma and Shanagabia were directly influenced by the reports of the Nile plague, providing that the Exodus was a continent event that shifted the balance of power forever, establishing a new era of freedom and sovereignty for the melanated families of the earth.
When you stand on this truth, you realize that your history is not a minor footnote in the story of the ancient world. You are connected to a global shift that altered the course of human civilization. The year 1446 BC is your anchor, a physical proof that the God of your ancestors was moving to reshape the world in your favor. Do not let mainstream academia rob you of this legacy. Study the primary sources for yourself. Reclaim the knowledge that was stolen from you, and recognize the divine hand that was moving under the African sun. The silent monuments of Kush are perhaps the loudest witnesses to this global shift, proving that the African soil has always held the record of the covenant. The sudden collapse of Egypt's military might after the Red Sea crossing had devastating consequences. When we examine the records, we find a sudden Egypt empire weakness, marked by the rapid decline of Hatshepsut's dynasty descendants. For decades, Egypt had dominated the trade routes of Nubia, but after 1446 BC, this hegemony evaporated. Mainstream history attributes this to court politics, but this common view ignores the loss of their army. The record suggests a sudden, catastrophic blow. While Egypt entered this dark age, the south experienced a Kush independence boom. The kingdom of Kerma, free from Egyptian threat, consolidated its control over the gold mines and trade routes. This was an overnight explosion of power. The Kushite kings expanded their trade networks, filling their capital with riches. I believe this Kushite boom was directly enabled by the destruction of Egypt's chariot corps. The balance of power had shifted, and Kush stood as the undisputed giant of the Nile Valley, proving the fall of one nation was the rise of another. At the same time, we find evidence of a massive West African migration. The builders of the Senegambian circles were expanding their settlements, carrying their astronomical knowledge across the Sahel. This was a structured expansion of a megalithic culture. When we trace the construction dates, we realize the expansion of these West African communities synchronized perfectly with the decline of Egypt and the rise of Kush. This proves that 1446 BC was a continental turning point, reshaping the African landscape. These simultaneous shifts completely deconstruct the linear European models of history. Mainstream textbooks want you to believe advanced civilization only moved from east to west, ignoring the vibrant network of African empires. But the physical evidence proves a different reality. While Egypt was humbled, the rest of Africa was rising to its greatest peak of technology and power. Perhaps they want to keep you in the dark about this synchronicity because it reveals the true strength of your ancestors. To understand how the plagues were physically manifested, we must examine the geological signs. Many scientists point to the Santorini volcanic eruption, one of the largest volcanic events in human history, which occurred during the mid-2nd millennium BC. This eruption sent plumes of ash and sulfur thousands of miles, triggering weather anomalies. I recall studying the ash layers found in the Nile Delta, which proved the fallout from Santorini reached Egypt. The comparison between the plagues and this eruption suggests a natural mechanism that God used to execute his judgments. This geological disaster is recorded in ancient Egyptian texts, most notably the Ipuwer Papyrus witness. The Ipuwer Papyrus is a lamentation written by an Egyptian scribe, describing a land in complete chaos. The text laments that the river is blood, and that plague is throughout the land. I remember reading the translations of this papyrus, feeling the raw panic of the scribe as he witnessed the destruction of his world. This is not a legend. It is a physical contemporary Egyptian witness that confirms the reality of the plagues. The Nile blood devastation was a physical reality. The volcanic fallout and ecological collapse turned the waters of the Nile red, killing the fish and making the water undrinkable. For the Egyptians, the Nile was the source of life, and its desecration was a direct blow to their identity. The plague was a systematic dismantling of their economy. I believe this ecological ruin prepared the way for the ultimate climax at the Red Sea, humbling the Pharaoh and proving the impotence of his gods. The physical signs were clear. As we examine these geological and historical witnesses, we feel the rising tension of the era. The earth itself was shaking under the judgment of the Creator. This was a catastrophic warning that shifted the course of history.
In my search, I fell the way of this conference, realizing the plague was the birth pang of the new era of freedom. In the next part of the chapter, we will witness the ultimate climax under the African suns, where the wave divided and the covenant was sealed.
The moment of ultimate crisis had arrived. Standing on the edge of the Nuweiba beach, with the mountains behind them and Pharaoh's army rapidly approaching, the children of Israel had nowhere to turn. But the Creator had already prepared the way. With a mighty wind, the miraculous path split the waters of the Gulf, opening a highway of dry land through the middle of the sea. Picture it. Millions of people walking through the deep chasm, their path illuminated by the pillar of fire. The scriptures tell us in the book of Exodus chapter 14 verse 22 that the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. This was not a shallow marsh. The walls of water Exodus 14 describes were massive barriers, rising hundreds of feet on either side, demonstrating the absolute sovereignty of God over the physical elements. As you sit with this image, you realize that the crossing was not just a historical event. It was a profound, spiritual reset. The division of the waters was the physical dividing line between slavery and freedom. Today, many truth seekers look at this path as a symbol of their own spiritual breakthrough, a sign that God can make a way where there is no physical hope. Mainstream science probably attempts to explain this event as a natural wind set down, but the underwater chariot wheel discovery on the land bridge suggests otherwise. Divers have found coral-encrusted wheels, axles, and human bones preserved under the waves. Perhaps these anomalies are the physical wreckage of the Egyptian army, left as a permanent witness to the miraculous deliverance. This physical proof shatters the skepticism of modern academia. The coral-encrusted wheels are not natural formations. They are the physical receipts of a historical judgment. When we connect these findings to the Rift Valley geology, we realize that the crossing was a real, physical event that occurred in the year 1446 BC. I believe that this discovery was preserved to wake you up today, proving that the God of your ancestors is real and active in history. Do not let them tell you that your heritage is a myth. The receipts are still resting on the floor of the Red Sea. The crossing of the Red Sea was not just the deliverance of Israel. It was the total destruction of Egypt's military might. As Pharaoh's army pursued the Hebrew refugees onto the land bridge, the walls of water collapsed, drowning the elite chariot corps and leaving the empire in economic and military ruin. This sudden destruction created an unprecedented Egypt military vacuum. The pharaoh had lost his chariot force, his elite soldiers, and his slave labor force in a single day. The southern borders were left completely undefended, leaving the empire vulnerable to its neighbors. Let us admit what standard history textbooks refuse to say. Egypt was crippled, a former superpower humbled by divine judgment. The new kingdom was thrown into a state of panic, unable to mount any major military campaigns for decades, as their records indicate. This military vacuum enabled a sudden Kush military expansion. The kingdom of Kerma, which had been developing to the south, capitalized on Egypt's weakness. The Kushite warriors marched northward, expanding their borders and taking control of the valuable gold trade routes. I think it is likely that Kush established a dominant presence in the region, securing their independence and wealth. This Nubian victory was a major turning point, but the Vatican and mainstream academia have spent centuries covering it up. They probably want to maintain the myth of European and Egyptian superiority, erasing the history of Kush's rise. But when you examine the timelines, the truth is clear. The fall of Egypt was the rise of Kush. Perhaps this cover-up was designed to keep the scattered remnant from recognizing their own royal heritage. This geopolitical shift proves that the Exodus was a continental catalyst. The destruction of Egypt's army in the sea reshaped the balance of power across the entire continent, paving the way for Kush's golden era. We must acknowledge this history, restoring our ancestors to their rightful place as key players in the biblical narrative. In the next part of this chapter, we will witness the activation of the covenant remnant under the African sun, examining how this physical deliverance prepared them for their divine destiny, proving that the covenant seed was destined to carry the light of the Creator to all nations. The deliverance at the Red Sea was not merely a physical rescue. It was a profound covenant identity reveal. On the other side of the water, under the blazing African sun, the Creator did not call them slaves anymore. He called them a peculiar treasure, a holy nation. This was the moment of restoring royal priesthood, a divine mandate that elevated the former captives to the status of spiritual leaders. If you study the scriptures, you will see that the covenant was designed to establish a direct relationship between the Creator and his people, free from the mediation of Egyptian priests. This royal status was not earned. It was a covenant inheritance, a gift of grace that bound their destiny to the land and the stars, establishing a permanent covenant that would survive the fall of empires. Why is this identity reveal so critical for you today? Because the same slave mentality that plagued the Israelites in the wilderness is still being taught in our schools and churches. They want you to believe that your history began in chains, ignoring the royal heritage of Cush, Egypt, and Israel. We must decode the spiritual meaning of the Nile covenant, recognizing that the blood of the patriarchs was intertwined with the ancient nobility of Africa. I believe this Nile covenant represents a permanent bond, a physical and spiritual legacy that cannot be broken by centuries of oppression. This is the truth that will shatter the slave mentality in this generation, restoring the dignity and power of your ancestors. Mainstream history usually paints your ancestors as mere onlookers in biblical events. But the archaeology and the scriptures prove that the covenant seed was deeply integrated into the royal houses of Africa. When we stand on this truth, we trigger a covenant seed awakening. The scattered remnant, dispersed to the four corners of the earth, is beginning to remember their name, their language, and their heritage. This is not a coincidence. It is the fulfillment of ancient prophecy. The scriptures probably warned that the remnant would be forgotten, but they also promise a day of restoration. Perhaps you have felt this awakening in your own heart, a hunger for truth that standard theology cannot satisfy. I think it is likely that this generation is the one chosen to reclaim the ancient paths, walking in the authority of the royal priesthood that was established in the desert 1446 BC. The awakening of the covenant seed is a physical reality, visible in the communities that are returning to the laws of the Creator. This history connects directly to your destiny. You are not a victim of history. You are the bearer of a divine legacy. The crossing of the Red Sea was the beginning of a journey that leads directly to your restoration today. Mainstream theology attempts to keep you in the dark about this continental connection, but the physical receipts are undeniable. As you reclaim the knowledge of Kush, Punt, and West Africa, you are rebuilding the spiritual walls of your house. We must walk in this light, recognizing that our ancestors were at the center of God's plan, and that the same power that divided the waters is moving to restore you today, ensuring that the legacy of the scattered remnant is preserved for all eternity. Reclaim your name. Reclaim your identity. You are the key. As we close this chapter of our journey, we must recognize the profound identity shift that this historical reconstruction demands. You are no longer required to accept the passive, Eurocentric narratives of the past. You must refuse the byword, rejecting the labels of inferiority and isolation that have been placed upon your heritage. The synchronicity of 1446 BC reveals that your ancestors were at the center of the global story, fully active in the kingdoms of Kush, West Africa, and Israel. I believe this truth changes everything, transforming how you view your place in the divine design. If this truth has ignited a spark in your heart, I urge you to comment Moses below to affirm your connection to this heritage. Share the message with your family, your friends, and your community to wake up those who are still asleep in the wilderness of ignorance. This is not a request for likes. It is a call to active recovery. We must spread the receipts of our history, probably starting with those closest to us. Perhaps this sharing is the first step toward a global restoration, preparing the community for the closing humility statement of this study. When we sit with these findings, we must do so with a spirit of intellectual honesty and academic humility. Scholars have weighed these texts for centuries and disagree on much. What I've offered is one careful reading, verifiable in the citations above. Study the primary sources for yourself. This closing humility variant 3 is a reminder that the truth is deeper than any single interpretation, encouraging you to examine the monuments and the scriptures with your own eyes. We do not claim exclusive prophetic authority. We probably present the physical receipts to provoke reflection. In this spirit, we offer a blessing all nations under the Creator, recognizing that all tribes and tongues are one under God. But our primary focus remains the remnant blessing, asking for strength, wisdom, and protection for the scattered family that is returning to the ancient paths. I think it is likely that this blessing will shield you from the confusion of the modern world, preparing you for the final prayer of this journey. Perhaps this peace will guard your heart as we prepare to speak to the Father. Let us bow our heads in heartfelt prayer to the Father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Father, we thank you for revealing the hidden things, restoring the memory of our ancestors, and the receipts of our heritage. We ask for your divine justice, perhaps exposing the systems of deception that have buried the truth for centuries. Protect the truth seekers, the scattered remnant, and all who are waking up to their covenant identity under the sun. Grant them strength to stand in the face of skepticism and wisdom to walk in your commandments. May they find peace in your presence. Breathe hope into the dry bones of the remnant, Father, and let your Spirit guide them as they walk in truth. Amen. I think it is through your grace that this generation is awakening. May your peace cover their homes and their cities, proving that the same power that divided the Red Sea is active to restore them today. Go forth in power, Refuse the chains of the mind. Walk in truth, you are free. Amen. The content provided on Dark History is for educational historical research and entertainment purposes only. The views, chronological alignments, and historical interpretations presented in this video reflect specific analytical perspectives and theoretical frameworks. They do not constitute official religious, academic, or professional consensus. Viewers are encouraged to conduct their own independent research and consult primary sources.